Hello, everyone. Welcome to JetBrains Connect, topics and talk from across the landscape of technology. Today on JetBrains Connect, localization helps make software and content more personal. Machine translation can help get more content to more locales. But at what cost? To quality, even to industry jobs. I'm your host, Paul Everett. Today, I'm joined by Mikhail Vink, Misha, my colleague and friend, driver for many product and marketing things at JetBrains. Welcome, Misha.
Thank you, Paul. I'm excited to be here with you today.
It's always good joining you on anything. Also joining us today, Janice Campbell, Senior Program Manager, Machine Translation Program at Adobe. Got a good one this time. Longtime practitioner, leader, speaker in the field of localization, and alumnus of Sun Microsystems, my first love. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both for appearing with us today on JetBrains Connect. Let's jump right in. Guests go first on JetBrains Connect. Janice, you've been in this field a while, I guess we can say, through a lot of technology changes, a lot. Perhaps the biggest one is going on right now. You've accumulated some good stories along the way, which we always enjoy on the episodes. Give us a little of your background.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And Developer Tools, which you all work for, is very close to my heart because I spent some time at Sun Microsystems working on developer tools, and also even at Adobe when we used to have Flash. That was one of the programs that I worked on. But I started my career basically studying modern languages, and I spent some time in studying in Europe as well. Then I went on to think that I might be able to be a translator someday, even though I wasn't really a real true bilingual speaker. So I spent some time also in Venezuela. After I graduated with my degree in translation and interpretation, I had this crazy idea. I should just go back to Venezuela. And this was, of course, long before the crisis that we have today in that country. And I just bought a one-way ticket, and I had maybe $500 in my pocket with no idea what I was going to do, where I was going to land. And I don't know. I don't know what really moved me to do that. So I did. And maybe you have the same thing when you do something crazy like that. You think once you get there, like, no, why did I do this? What am I doing here? But in the end, things just somehow work out. And I'm probably in the wrong place at the right time. And I ended up being a university professor teaching translation and interpretation, and being a freelance translator and interpreter, eventually going into private industry and working with air defense systems of all things. And then I came back to the US and worked in what we call localization, translation companies, language service providers. I really wanted to work in localization. I was really fascinated by technology and software and the intersection with languages. And I was living at that time in Silicon Valley. So what else? I should be in high tech, right? And so I couldn't get my foot in the door because everybody was saying you need a degree in computer science. You just can't, which we know isn't really true today. But in any case, I said, okay, fine. The Fortran I took in the 80s, that doesn't count. Well, not really. Okay. Well, then let's go to community college and take a bunch of classes. And I did. That got my foot in the door. And I have to say that I don't think I ever used any of that in my job, but it got me in the door. And then I worked in high tech for now it's more than 20 years. I'm very involved in my industry, and I am sometimes a speaker, panelist, moderator, or an organizer. Right now, I'm an organizer for different organizations that hold events. And I've been speaking at Localization World, Globalization and Localization Association, a couple of machine translation organizations, TAOS and AMTA. I'm on the board of AMTA, which is machine translation, and we organized a conference last year, another one this year, MT Summit. Also organizing Gala has a conference this year as well. And then I volunteer for a Department of State program called Tech Women, where we bring women from technical women in STEM from Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia to Silicon Valley to do these learnings and internships. And those, I've been involved since 2013 with that program. And actually a couple others. I'm on two boards of directors. So I'm kind of busy, and I sometimes joke that, well, I think my job's just getting in the way. But anyway, that's in a nutshell my background.
Well, thanks, Janice. That's a perfect background for helping us to frame the core issue, but also kind of keep our eye on the people that are involved. Misha, you're a cook in many of the kitchens at JetBrains, including localization. Tell us a little bit about your background, but also the kinds of things that you now have on your plate, kind of help people slot how localization fits into a large software company.
Oh my gosh, that's really tough to introduce myself after Janice, I have to say, because I'm really far from localization. And well, bear with me, I think there is a reason they actually invited me here. So there is some connection. But actually, back in the days, back in high school, I started as a software developer. That was my first job when I was like 14, I think. And then I started my own businesses back in Russia, where I used to live. I was doing software development there with my teams, and actually studied computer science and computer security. But at some point, I actually moved on from my businesses and joined JetBrains to work on the products, starting with PHP Storm. That was like 8 years ago. And actually, a funny story. I remember my interview with our HR director, Natalie, and Eugene, our director of marketing, and we've been discussing that before JetBrains, every 2 years, I would found a new company, or do something else, do different projects. And I was always referring that I got bored and I decided to do something else. And they asked me, what are you going to do in 2 years after you get bored? And I told them, yeah, we will see. We need to figure it out. And now I'm 8.5 years at JetBrains, and it seems that we kind of figured it out. And after I got bored, I basically moved to different marketing, management, and business-related projects at JetBrains. Right now, I'm mostly involved into the monetization projects with Space, our integrated team environment, the new products, and a lot of different things, really. And I actually was working with our sales team on building our regional marketing and regional sales operations. And that's actually which brings me to the localization question. And that is the reason why I was pushing localizations in JetBrains, and that's actually pushing the creation of the department of localization, because that was something I really needed for our regional marketing and what we needed for our regional strategy in general to be successful in the regions like China, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, and many other regions where English is not native language. So that's where the localization are coming from, and I will be very happy to discuss it with you today.
Cool. Great. Thank you both for your backgrounds. We're about to get started a little bit now on the background for localization. We're talking today about a particular aspect of localization, which means we kind of need to get localization itself explained and framed correctly, as well as getting into that aspect of localization. Janice, some of our audience might not really know what localization entails, or others, maybe like me, might know, but know incorrectly or not know the full breadth of issues. Could you spend a couple of minutes on the business and practice of localization?
Well, let me start with defining it. And I have to say that in our industry, we are guilty of using jargon and acronyms in our industry. And the reason I say guilty is because we call it GILT, G-I-L-T, globalization, internationalization, localization, and translation. Seriously, we do. And some people joke and say, well, we need the real guilt word in there, G-U-I-L-T. So let's put Unicode in as the U, and then we have guilt. And but we tend to abbreviate. You've probably seen localization abbreviated as L10N, internationalization as I18N, globalization G11N, translation T9N, culturalization C13N. I don't know why. I don't know how that came about. But people were just started doing that, and so now you see it everywhere. So globalization in itself gets sort of a bad rap because everybody thinks about all these horrible trade practices that seem to impede some countries from being able to be self-sufficient or to gain some part of the world revenue. But in our field, globalization really is just the strategy of taking your product and service worldwide. And the subsets of that are the internationalization and localization parts of it. So when we say internationalization, what we really mean is that we're preparing the product or service to go international. So you're not really necessarily translating anything. You're not necessarily putting it into another language. You might just keep it in your source language, but you are enabling the product to be used in country. So you might be doing things like making the date time formats appropriate for that region, or allowing people to input their language into any forms. So there's so many different parts of internationalization, but it's designing the product so that it can go into an international market. And that's a lot of code work, a lot of coding. And I'm sure that at JetBrains, you're very familiar with that. Calendars, number formats, numerical systems, sorting lists, alphabetization, those kind of things are all forms of address. Those are all things that go into internationalization. And once a product is internationalized, then it's much easier to localize. It's really hard to turn yourself into a pretzel and try to localize when your product isn't internationalized. And I'm sure that many of you have faced that as well. So now we're adapting our product to the local market. We are making it locale specific. So that's more customization and personalization, and including the language part of it. And there may be some cultural aspects that need to be adapted as well. And then finally, we have translation, which is converting one language to another, human language, natural language to another. And of course, all of these things require a lot of processes and tools and automation and skilled people to do it.
That's the important part. I'm sure as you were saying that and talking about the amount of work it takes to prep the software, Misha in the back of his head was crying out saying, yes, it's insane. But we're focusing today on the impact of machine translation. And you just went through a number of the guilt parts. And this is the part I believe that we're going to zoom in on, machine translation, or MT. Can you explain to us what machine translation, what that's about, and what's the state of the art here in 2021?
State of the art. Well, it's changing every day. So I think you have to be reading all day long in order to know what's happening and be involved in a lot of research projects. But from the commercial, practical point of view, machine translation is where you've built some software to automate the translation without any human intervention, and that's in a nutshell. Probably most people are familiar with some of the online services, Google Translate or Bing Translate, or there's any number of these. Lingway is kind of another one, which is DeepL. So how did it all start? The history is before I was born. It doesn't seem possible, but it was. And in the late 40s, maybe early 50s, where there was some experimentation, usually in research being done by universities, in conjunction with those companies that created those big mainframe servers back in the day, like IBM, and maybe doing some kind of machine translation by plugging in terminology and some kind of rules, grammatical rules and style rules, and then outputting some of that. And I think during the Cold War was when it became even more necessary, because we're spying on everybody. They're spying on us. And so, of course, there were a lot of systems of English and Russian. So that might be interesting to you, Misha. So, and maybe you even know about that. But as far as commercially viable, not just in spy world and in research, and there's certainly tons of research happening all the time. But commercially, we started out with in the late 50s with rule-based machine translation, RBMT, which lasted at least 30 years. And actually, there are systems that are still using that today. Some of those are like converting language variants, like English, U.S. English to UK English, or international French to French Canadian, and things like that. They still do that because it's based on grammar, it's based on terminology. Then we moved more into things like statistical machine translation, phrase-based, and that was probably about 1990, and again lasted, maybe 20 or more years. And that's where the machines have statistical algorithms that say, well, this phrase in this context might be the best way to do it. You're still somewhat word and terminology based, but now you've got some algorithms that help to make decisions about the best fit, this type, and it learns. And then these machines start to learn, and you can train them and you can customize them based on certain domain knowledge, or you can do it on your particular company's authoring style and things like that. And now we're in the field, the architecture that is neural machine translation based on a lot of deep learning, machine learning, which uses neural networks to be able to translate. And I'm not really a researcher, but some of the architectures are, RNN, CNN, convolution neural networks. That was, I think Facebook used that at one time. Now it's attention-based transformational seems to be the big thing right now. And that's really the state of the art since about 2015.
That's interesting about company style. I hadn't really thought of that as part of the academic theory and the kind of tool chain and the methodology being used. Thanks for the background on that. With that framed, Misha, let's talk about this in practice. What's going on with localization at JetBrains?
Yeah, definitely. So in fact, like one step before localization, we actually been doing, like in terms of their marketing in JetBrains, we always been doing their English first, like internationalized marketing, always approached in English until 2015, when we actually started doing their regional marketing, regional sales development, and regional business development. And that's where we actually started to invest more into localization in general. And that doesn't really mean that we never translated or localized things before. No, of course we did. We would have the emails localized and some other things. And we actually had their major products here, IntelliJ, localized like many, many years ago. But it was actually one of their misfires, I would say, because that was kind of premature. So there was single time localization and to Japanese only, and the part of internationalization was done for the IntelliJ platform, and then it actually didn't go further. And that was, of course, a bummer when we started talking about localizing the products like in 2015 and 2016, because there was this experience somewhat like 7-8 years ago before that, which was not pleasant, and it didn't go anywhere. And there could be a lot of reasons for that, but we can just, think about them. And the market was very different. But basically, starting from 2015, we've been investing into the regional market development and approaching local markets differently, adapting our marketing strategy, adapting the platform, adapting the message, and translating, localizing a lot of things. And I think this actually created their localization department here back in 2018. So it's roughly 3 years after we started this massive prototyping of the local activities, when we would approach markets like China or Japan differently from how we would approach all the other markets. And we basically proven that there is a lot of sense in doing that. And there is a lot of sense in investing into localization as well. And we started approaching localization as part of like one of the major parts of the strategy for our regional development and of course for our marketing for our products. And we started from their materials, all the digital materials, basically everything which leads to their purchase or download of the product, we would have localized. And after that, when we actually been ready with the products here, a couple of years after that, we started localizing IntelliJ as the major desktop product. Before that, we had an experience with localizing UTrack, which is our issue tracking solution. But there were basically a lot of things here which we needed to get right, both in localization of the products and localization of the process of the user path towards the product usage. And I guess a couple of bigger things we had to learn and get used to is that first, that is kind of like a trade-off. There will be a trade-off when you localize, and some things might not be perfect from the first minute and from the first attempt. And that was kind of hard for us to take as perfectionists, because we want it to be perfect, but it's really hard because there are so many things involved into getting their localization right. And another thing is that it took us some time to understand that localization is much bigger than the translation of the text. As Janice was mentioning, there is like so many things involved. And a lot of people historically think that localization is about translation of one language to another. But no, there are a lot of things involved into it, and there are a lot of things which has to be done on the side of many different teams. And for them, that might not be the priority, and you need to make it the priority for them so that it kind of comes to the point when you actually can release a good localized product and localized experience to help users be successful.
It seems like the kind of thing that even if you did get something perfect, next year it would be wrong again or something like that. It's got to be really challenging.
Yes.
And I also like how you kind of,
and
I like how you tried to slip marketing into the guilt stack that Janice was talking about. Maybe you have to start M16 in or M16G or whatever the number would be for that. I think we get a little bit of background on the ideas, the industry, the theory, the technology. Okay, now that we have the backstory on localization and machine translation, let's get back to the core issue. Localization helps make software and content more personal. Machine translation can help get more content to more locales. But what's the cost of this? What's the quality cost? A little bit what we just talked about, perfection. And what's kind of even the cost for industry jobs? Janice, before we tackle that, let's start on the other side. How is machine translation helping localization?
I really prefer to think that it's helping customers and end users. And it's not machine translation, for itself, or translation. Some people tend to think translation, for itself, for its own sake. But it's really about getting information to your customers. You're trying to acquire customers. You're trying to retain them. Now everybody's moving, especially in software. People are moving to subscription models. In 30 days, they can get rid of their subscription. So you want to keep them. You want to keep them in your ecosystem. If you don't offer something in their language, especially in places where where they're less tolerant of having English. There are many regions are tolerant of English, and they don't necessarily need to have everything translated, localized, etc. But if you don't offer it, what do they do? And I've actually done some analytics, web analytics, and seen some of the results that people just go to Yandex, people go to Baidu, people go to Google Translate, and they translate your content. And that takes them outside of your ecosystem, right? So you want to keep them in the ecosystem. So one way that we did that was when we didn't offer something in their language, we just maybe had some machine translation. We didn't have budget for the human translation part. Maybe it's a low revenue country or region or something. So giving them a little widget where they can click on it sort of at their own risk. This isn't going to be perfect, but you can find things. What you really want is for usability. More than quality, you want usability. There's quality, it has to be defined. Everybody says quality, but nobody defines it. So you have to really decide, what is your definition? What is your threshold for that quality? And does it apply to all types of content or only some types of content? What you do for marketing is very different what you might do for help and support. And you have to take that into account. It's one size doesn't fit all. So keep them in your ecosystem. If it help them. When a person wants usability or utility, it's because I want to go to your website and I want to find some information. I want to buy. I might want to try first. I want to fill out a form. I want to send you an email. I want to download a PDF. I'm an Adobe, so it has to be a PDF. And those kind of actions don't require, like I say, it's fit for purpose. How do they get it fast? Maybe at some point you can write over it with the human edited types of translation. But right now you want them to be able to find what they need to find to get things done. Nobody wants to wait. We didn't talk about it, but we probably should, that, especially software, which has now applied to other types of content, is, the SIM shift. simultaneous shipment. We release all the languages at the same time as English. That applies to software, but also to other types of content. And now, having the CI/CD, CL, the continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous localization, which allows you to speed up that process, be more agile. We're not waterfall anymore; we're all agile, and so it's getting that information to customers and users immediately. There's probably more content and volume in the world being produced and created not only by your company but by your communities as well, who offer blogs, tutorials, etc. So how do you get that all done? There's probably not enough, professional translators, humans to do it. So that's where I think, things like machine translation comes in, and you want to keep them in your ecosystem.
A lot of things you just said that were really interesting. And it kind of reminds me a little bit about the revolution in supply chains and global supply chains and the velocity and complexity.
Exactly.
While time to market goes down and down and down. And some of those same factors are happening now on the software side. People expect bigger reach, faster turnaround time in more locales. And are our practices able to keep up with it? You also said something that I hadn't thought about, which is it's not just about the vectors of, is this region more tolerant than that region on the quality of the localization, but also different audiences, like the marketing audience versus the developer audience versus the business director audience. So this all makes sense, at least a promise of it. Misha, there's some machine translation in JetBrains localization efforts, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, the only one thing which we released publicly, and I was like a small Easter egg, we managed to sneak in when we've been releasing their website localization a couple of years ago, and that's their machine translation to Klingon, which is actually provided by Bing. And we had it there. Well, it was not perfect,
That's a fun one.
And usability aspect was
no complaints from the Klingon community, right?
Well, actually, I have to tell you that we got some bug reports because some of the words like of their Klingon were not correct. So, quality. But yeah, also there are like a few options to name things differently in Klingon. But yeah, it was like mix and match. So that was probably our first attempt. But in reality, we are working already for quite some time to train some of their models and engines and compare them to figure out what's going to be our approach to their web help. So we have a lot of content in the documentation, in the web documentation, and we want to localize it to a lot of languages. And so far, well, we definitely understood that it's not going to happen with a human translation just because it is just so much content and it changes so quickly, and there are so many things. And we have like dozens of releases per year of different products. It's just unrealistic. And as Janice said, it is about the time to market. We need to release it as soon as possible. We need to release it to different locales. It is just not feasible for us to contract thousands of people to localize the content, which is changing every day. So yeah, that's what we're working on right now. And that's what localization team is investigating. And we do some tests of the external systems, but also we have some folks on the JetBrains research side, which is our scientific division, and they actually do some investigation there as well, just to see what models and what is possible there.
Yeah. Just as a disclaimer, this episode will not be subtitled in Klingon. Our apologies on behalf of JetBrains. So, machine.
Oh my gosh! No,
I know. There went all the viewers, right?
We will get
so machine
reports.
True.
But I can guarantee
you
everybody's going to rush off to Microsoft Translator now and look for it.
I guess so. Just what you said about you don't want to lose people outside of the ecosystem. Machine translation in localization has two issues that we really want to tackle in this episode. The first is quality. Janice, what's the state of the art in machine translation localization, machine versus traditional human effort that you have a long background in? And are different cultures willing to accept the results?
Do you have an hour?
I'm sure you've got some great stories.
Quality is measured. And so that's the only way you can define it. What are you measuring? And with human translation, we measure, there's the various different methodologies of error typology, related to grammar, spelling, style, etc. So That happens in general anyway. But what do you do with a machine? Well, once you've customized one of these services, we call them engines. An engine is, a domain, probably customized to a particular domain or subject, and then it language pair. So by language pair. And once you customize them, there's various different what they call auto scores that are produced from that training, and you decide if you like it or not. And then if you don't, if it doesn't meet your standards, then you can sort of keep on retraining it, tweaking. Usually, you're tweaking the input data. In some cases, depending on the provider, the machine translation provider, you could, possibly tweak some of the algorithms as well. So it kind of depends on the particular service. And we measure a lot of different things. There's many different scores. Blue, this one called Blue Score, which is a very common one, started in statistical machine translation, but everybody hates it, but everybody just uses it, even though everybody hates it, says it's really not valid anymore. It's always all these quality scores. We have the things that are probably more relevant today to commercial use are like edit distance. So what does it take? How many strokes, so to speak, or how many additions, omissions, etc., to make that machine translated content viable and usable by human readers, right? And there's other types of auto scoring. There's so many of them, lots of them, but it's always comparing the machine translation to a human translation without taking into account two factors. One of them is that humans are fallible and they make mistakes. And so that translation you're comparing it to, it might not be perfect. So, but you're comparing it against it and assuming it's the gold standard when it might not be. And also, all of you speak, various different languages, and that you can translate any phrase into any number of ways, and it still can be relevant and have the same meaning. It's just the way that you express it. You might have a different style. So when you're comparing it to just one gold standard, then it's really difficult to say that, this machine fails, but it's being compared to an unrealistic gold standard. That's quality. But we now do things like we do some human evaluations as well. And the human evaluations are usually on a 5-point scale, which is accuracy and fluency. So you have various users. I try not to use linguists, maybe like a person who's not going to look at it from the linguistic point of view, but from like the customer point of view, how do they perceive these strings? And is it very accurate compared to the source language? And does it sound fluent? Because it might be very accurate, but it's not necessarily very fluent. It could be very stilted. Another thing is usability. Can the person perform an action based on this? Can they, like I said before, can they download a PDF? Can they fill out a form? Can they push a buy button, etc., in a language that's not theirs, but that's machine translated, and maybe it's a little rough, and maybe it's not perfect, which we don't really know how to define, but it's fit for purpose. They can do what they need to do, and that's what we're looking for in those kind of situations. So quality, I think, I've been in the translation industry, really more decades than I want to tell you. And I have to say that we've been talking about quality and what it means. In fact, even at one company, I wrote a whole paper just on quality because nobody defines it. So you have to decide what you mean by quality and what is your threshold for different content types and different audiences.
Right. And as you said, compared to what? Let's not treat the machine compared to human as the humans are perfect at this. Let's stay with you.
Yeah, but that's what we do. We still do that.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. And actually, have you done any localization projects where the humans had pairs and they did two people doing a translation just to, and then compare the two to see if they got it right?
Usually in experiments and tests, people do that.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For evaluation tests.
Was it revealing?
Yeah. And like I say, I think the things that I've noticed in the test cases, we don't do that commercially. It's just too expensive. You might do some editing or review of that.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be using two translators except,
Right.
maybe you're testing a person and their ability, which we usually leave up to the language service providers. But in the machine translation, when they're evaluating it, we see different ways that they see the same thing. Yeah, definitely. So we try, whenever we do human evaluations of MT, we try to have, 2 to 4 per language to evaluate, because then maybe average it out, or because sometimes they say the same things and sometimes really opposite feeling about things.
Interesting. Let's stay with you and jump into the tough part. And this is the thing that really
Okay.
stuck out with me when we did the prep.
Okay.
I'll just put it in a blunt, provocative YouTube style. Should localizers be afraid for their jobs?
I want to say yes. Okay, I do want to say yes, and not really because I think it's imminent. I think it's inevitable, because it's not imminent.
Okay.
There's so much volume. It's an explosion of content, and there's so much to be done, and some of it just requires the human touch. So I don't think that their jobs are going away, but certain types of content might be more suitable for machine translation, and maybe that part is going to go away. And so I don't know that, but there's certainly other types of careers or career paths. I think I want to say that for anybody, and it's not just for translators. I mean, all of our jobs. When we see automation, we see robotics, we see AI. Different subsets of AI really being gaining ground and becoming better and better all the time. That all of us need to think about that. And it's not just a linguist. So from the language point of view, I think that there are certainly other types of careers that we are seeing that are growing. So you, me, everybody, we have to be relevant all the time. Doesn't matter who we are. We have to be relevant. And the world changes so fast. It's not even web time anymore. It's, the speed of light. And so we have to know how to be marketable. We have to be looking at trends. We have to be keeping up to date with what is happening. Even if we can't predict the future, we have to be able to kind of foresee to some extent what's going to happen. For translators, or linguists in general, and I'm not talking about, people who write code and engineers and stuff, who obviously are probably seeing some of that as well, because localizers consist of a lot of, engineers, software engineers. But from the linguistic point of view, already some things have changed, because linguists are more involved in the post-editing. Instead of translating from scratch, we have translation memory, which is all the previously translated strings that were done by, with some human intervention, and then machine translation. And then they have to edit all that together and push out something that, is coherent and that it fits together well and that is very fluent. So, that's one area. But one of the big areas is data, really a lot of data. And linguists could be very valuable in data curation, data annotation, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about that. They can also be in the world of business, for example, analytics, web analytics, all types of analytics, where you're trying to not only see what people do and how they interact with your products, but also be able to predict. There's predictive analytics, which is AI driven. Another area, which is more, I guess I'll call it soft skills, is or social sciences, cultural anthropology and sociology, being hired all the time in many companies to understand customer journeys and user experiences and interfaces. And those are the kind of things. I mean, I could go to a lot of different types of jobs, but those are probably the main ones. Being able to interact with computers and being able to train them and give feedback, being able to evaluate the output, feed the corrections back into a machine. Those are very valuable kinds of jobs that are coming up and probably require a slightly different skill set. And in which case, we really need our universities to catch up with that as well and be able to offer the right kind of courses for that.
It's interesting, the point that you're making. You made a point about, you gave a long pause before you replied. And you make a point about it's coming and ML and machine translation. We in the industry know it's coming. We know it's not going to be just disruptive. It's going to be exponentially disruptive. And we as a society really are not keeping our eye on this. And it kind of reminds me of this famous quote about they asked someone, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was slowly, then quickly. And I worry that the speed at which machines are going to take some of these jobs and turn them into commodities, you're right. The people that get that happen to them just have to find a new value add on top of that. Misha, let's hear from you. Machine translation's impact on quality and job.
Oh, well, yeah. Actually, Janice put it perfectly well with their fit for purpose. It is right. So it is like really valuable thing. And I think that there are a lot of things about making a kind of trade-off and finding the balance. And they're based on our experience, but also the research I've seen from different agencies is that, in a lot of regions, and especially Asia, I believe, people would be better off generally with their some kind of even low quality localization, but actually a lot of the machine translation right now is not even low quality. It is actually good. It's good enough. It's good enough to press the button. It's good enough to download the software. It's good enough to start using the software. And this good enough part is very important because users really start using the product, or they achieve something, or they do something else they wanted to achieve. And that's just thanks to all this automatic machine translation. It's just happening much quicker than they would achieve that, just compared to our normal process of localizing everything manually. So yeah, even if the quality would be like degrading for some time, it's going to get better because we will just train our engines, train our models. It's just going to get better. And even with that, most probably people will be able to achieve a lot of things. But as for their jobs and losing the jobs of translators, well, we probably have a good example here, right? So we could have got like computational voice Paul, but we still got like real Paul. And probably, we could have just, I don't know, pay $1 in the API for the usage of this computational voice. But that would be probably like not the same emotionally. It would lack emotion. Somebody would have to go ahead and program it. Somebody would have to verify that it's all correct. And that would actually lack this authenticity, which we have here, just talking freely on the internet and just discussing all these things. So it's just, you can do it. Yeah, you can replace it, but there will be jobs which are probably like a bit slightly different from what you used to do before. You don't need to translate everything. You verify, as Jenny said, or you train the model, or you operate the computers, or any other things. So it's just a lot of things you can do, just removing these routine things, automating these routine things, and then you move on. And there are so many things you can do. And the time you manage to free, well, you can actually go and have a rest. Like that would be actually awesome if like 5 years from this moment, we would automate a lot of the routine. And instead of working more, we would generally work less and be happier and get a healthier lifestyle and work-life balance and all these things. That would be probably one of the best outcomes out of this automation of these kinds of jobs as well, right?
Totally a European perspective, right?
I like to say something about it. I totally agree with you. And one thing that really I hate more than anything is these mundane tasks that just add no value. I really like the value added. I did a bunch of work in Six Sigma for one time, and I actually I did this whole study about localization end to end, and I did several months long, studied the whole entire pipeline. And then I presented it to the whole entire group and said, okay, guess what? About 90% of what we do has no added value. And I tell you, I thought they were going to hang me. And people were so angry at me and just said, stop, get her out of Six Sigma, and we're not changing anything because it's their job. And it's like, but there's room, as you said, Misha, there's room for you to do more valuable kind of work. I remember in the old days when you had to send stuff through modems, and you had, I remember working in the language service provider and walking in the door, and there's like a stack of faxes sitting on the floor of jobs that we needed to do. And it's like, and I got to write them on 3-ply carbon copies to fill out the forms. And who wants to do that? That's not fun. We want to do things that are more strategic, that require us to think. So if automation and AI can help us to do things better. And if you don't mind, if I give another example, it's not even in our industry. When you go get an MRI or an X-ray or whatever, guess who reads that first? It's actually it's artificial intelligence looking at it first. And if you have some kind of a major illness or a tumor that nobody detected, you really want that to happen. You want them to see it first, because the human eye often doesn't detect it. So it's signaling it and then sends it to a human. So it can be very valuable. And I guess I got off track on that, but it's probably applicable to our industry as well. We want people to find information, use our products, love our products, get information about how to love our products, whatever it is. And machine translation can help us to produce that, sometimes perfectly and sometimes not very perfectly.
You're right about the value add, Misha, your point about the replacing me with a bot. I was on a project with someone recently who did Amazon Polly for text to speech, and I had a little bit of that worry feeling, but I went and looked, and they don't have a language for American redneck yet. So I'm good.
Perfect.
I'm good.
But they will.
Perfect.
And that's
But
what
they
linguists are
will.
doing.
They will.
They're
Maybe they were using me. They were
training the
using
speech
me
for
to
that.
train the redneck into the system.
You have the niche
Thanks.
for some time, Paul. You have the niche. It's all good.
I know. I need to
Google has
work it
just
while
a
I
whole
got it.
department on personality. It's called personality or something, and they train speech, with different accents
That
and
is
things
horrifying.
like that. I know. Oh well.
All right. Thanks, both of you, for getting us zeroed in on the key issue. We'll unpack a little bit more of it in the discussion. With the core issue framed, let's have an open discussion on some of the points. Janice, I want to come back to something that you hinted at a little bit about what parts of the user journey you might be talking about.
Okay, that should be localized.
Yeah.
And like I said, machine translation isn't really outside of our process. It's actually integrated into a localization process. So it's not one or the other. I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that. But as far as like the user journey, I have this recall about 6 years ago. We had a globalization summit internally where we invited not just our globalization teams, but also our stakeholders internally, the people that used our localization services. And to them, it's transparent. They don't know if, MT is built into any of this stuff. And then we also brought in some of the customer experience people. And so to start off the meeting, our director, who's from Belgium and is a French speaker, got up and showed the Adobe website and just started going through a typical customer journey. So he's on the Belgian site. He's got all of his content in French, where he starts off on the marketing pages, exploring products, and then he might go into learning more deeply about the products and going to try a product, download it for free, get up and running on it, which means going to some tutorials or some learn pages, can't figure out some things, goes to support content, and then tries to manage his account. So he went through this whole entire journey, which was very interesting, except that he was often not in French. If he clicked on another part of this journey, he might be in English. But what was worse, he wasn't just in English, he was on the US site. And of course, that sales are different. There's different laws regarding selling products in different places. So now he's like, well, I've got to get back to Belgium, but I don't know how to get back to the Belgian site. Oh, I have to go all the way back to the beginning to the actual website to get there. So as he's going through this journey, he's going in and out of English, in and out of French, and in back and forth to these websites. And I tell you, by the end of that, everybody's jaw just dropped. It's like, I had no idea. I had no idea. If I were an Adobe customer, I just wouldn't do business with you because it's so painful. And in fact, at that point, you probably used to logging bugs and you say there's P1, P2, P3, for example. The customer experience people said, no, I want emotion about that. We're going to call P1 egregious. We're going to call P2 painful. We're going to call P3 inconvenient. Okay? Because we want people to understand the emotion as you walk through and you are a customer. So we all had to do that end-to-end customer experience testing in different locales and different regions in order to feel that pain. Because if you don't feel the pain, you don't know what your customers are feeling. And that's, and as I said, machine translation is part of that, but it's integrated and it's in many cases invisible to our customers because all they see is their language. only if they have to click on a widget, or sometimes it's a little bit hard to read. They might think it's machine translation, but in reality, they're not thinking, oh, this is a great translation or a bad one. They're thinking, can I understand my language or not? Can I get to where I need to go in my language and know how to do it? And can I perform an action?
The point you made about Belgium and French and English, my first year in Europe, I had an interesting story. I went to visit a Belgian company, and the Dutch person spoke French and the French person spoke Dutch, but they spoke English to each other.
That's true. I lived in Belgium for a short time. Yeah, they do that.
Yeah. So a question for both of you. Janice, we'll go with you first because I think you can help frame it in a way that Misha can then respond to. When should a company localize? When is it not worth it?
I think the question is wrong. It's when should you not?
Okay.
When should you not? And so the customer journey, okay, that it's painful. So where's those touch points? When you don't localize is when your target audience, they might not be native English speakers, but they prefer English. And that could be true for some products. And that happens a lot for some of our digital marketing products, where most of the customers are probably enterprise. And they might be international and they do business in English, or another international language, maybe French or something else. But when you have, we have our creativity products, the creative products, which are more at every level. So it's not just enterprise customers; you have consumers and everything in between. Small to medium business. Some regions really prefer things in their language. France has a lot of regulations about selling and using products, and you have to adhere to all of those regulations. And while Japan doesn't have that necessarily, everybody's aware that in Japan, English isn't a language that's used so much in business, and they really prefer things in their language. And so everybody says, oh, well, you give them human translations and they tear it apart because they want everything just so natural, and I can't blame them. That's, a very important market for many companies. But when they're faced with, you're not producing this in my language, it's only in English, I'll take the crappy MT over that.
Misha, do you have a follow-up on this? When making the decision internally, when did you go from not going to do it to going to do it?
Well, actually, before answering that, I would probably elaborate a bit on when you should not localize. And there's a second option I see, in addition to what Janice said, is that there are some countries, and there is a place there for the local companies and the local business. You can be successful non-international business in China. You can generally be successful like somewhere in Latin America, just covering, for example, Latin American Spanish, and that would be good enough for you. You don't need to go international. Maybe at some point you have to, but let's say the startup in Finland doing everything in Finnish. I love Finnish. That's actually my third language I learned in my life. It's amazing, but no offense, folks, but you probably cannot get a big market with Finnish-only application on the internet because just the market is too small. So that really depends. But there is this place for local small businesses. People will love, people will use, but at some point you still have to localize, but probably you can just delay it by 5 years or something like that. But for JetBrains, the journey was interesting because we basically had everything in English and we needed to go to the local markets just to make it better for the users so that they can understand us, so that they can talk to us easier and so on. And I think there is no question of localization or no localization. It's the question of when exactly. And when exactly do you need to localize is probably as early as possible for international company, at least even if you don't localize, at least internationalize. Because if you don't, then you end up with let's say 15 years of product development without extracted strings from a desktop application, and it's going to be tough. You will have to get the entire team working on that for a few months to get it ready for localization, and that's going to hurt because it's just too much
let me get
effort.
you to give a quick follow-up on that. How hard is it to get the various parts of the organization to join in on the localization effort, whether it's marketing for preparing materials all the way down to the software?
Oh, probably just show them the impact they are doing. That's probably the easiest one. And maybe some anecdotal evidence, or, when the pandemic is over, just send them to the country where no one speaks English and they will understand the importance.
Money talks.
Yeah.
Show them their loss of revenue.
Yeah.
That's usually the one that gets to them.
Not to developers, though.
Well, that's true.
Okay, Misha, companies grow, position themselves as global when maybe they're not. And then they realize something and change the strategy to be more local. Kind of winds up being kind of funny.
Yeah, that's probably like interesting evolution of the business altogether, because you start, let's say, in one country of Europe, and you start developing your startup or the company, and then you understand that your local market is too small for you, so you would like to go outside and go to Europe, go to the US, grow the market. You go there, you become the international company, thinking in English, doing everything in English all year, like very nice international. And then you realize that, in fact, in order to serve your users well, in order to provide a good service, good product, you have to go local. And it is like very interesting that you go back and then you go this and that country and you localize and do the things. But then even more importantly is how you execute that, because you can create like a true local experience which people will love, or you can create a fake experience which people will be like, oh, that's bad. It's just that maybe that's bad localization, maybe that's bad cultural adaptation. A lot of things can go wrong, and you definitely don't want to make these mistakes when you go to the local level again.
This will be a question similar to that about scaling up too big and then scaling back down. It's also related to a point Janice made earlier about imprecise localizations. And different cultures are more accepting of bad, imprecise localization. Some demand high fidelity, even if it means they're not going to get anything, versus some that might be accepting of good enough as long as they get something. Janice, talk to us a little bit about over the decades with human translation in this effort, and then whether you see the rate of improvement of machine translation being able to solve this.
That's a hard question. I mean, again, humans are not perfect. We tend to think that they're more perfect than machines, but that isn't really necessarily the case. They're just different, and they might be perfect at different things. Or so any mistakes that humans make, humans create the machine, so the machines make make mistakes too. Sometimes we have these horrific translations of funny ones. There's whole websites about those. I know you've probably seen English.com, and I think there's some other websites that have memes of every time you go to a restaurant in some other country and you get the menu and it mostly doesn't make sense, or if it does, it's talking about things that are inappropriate and languages that are inappropriate. And we all have funny examples of those, and I won't repeat them all here. Near where I live, there's actually a golf course, and they've written some signs in Spanish, and I speak Spanish, so it's like, this is not, don't use the water because it's the water's not drinkable. It's irrigation on the golf course, and it's been recycled. That kind of some kind of message like that. And the first time I saw it was like nailed on a blackboard. It was like, agua no bebible. It's just, of course in Spanish, the expression is no potable, not potable water, potable. But then they also called the golf course, the curso de golf, literal translation, which is like, I'm not learning golf. I'm not taking a course in it. It's a campo de golf. So, and that's not really funny. It's just like, ooh, that hurts when I see it. Right. And we all kind of know that. And certainly, I think one time what happened at Adobe was, fairly recently, you often get, and probably Misha knows this as well, that translators get strings out of context quite often, and they just don't know where it fits in, and they just get hundreds of strings, and they do the best they can. So the machine might see it first, and it translated Apple, the company, as manzana, the apple, the fruit. And the human is supposed to do the post editing and didn't notice it either. And so here it goes out, into the product. And we ended up, the customer had to tell us, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. And that's a little bit embarrassing. So you get those kind of things. Machine translation tends to do different things. They're not perfect systems. So, but you have to decide, what is okay and what's not okay. And neural machine translation, which it tends to be, statistical, was very accurate, but not very fluent. Now, neural, the joke is it's more fluent, but not very accurate sometimes. And that's not all the time. But sometimes it just randomly just omits words, because it's learning all the time and taking these different pathways. And sometimes it adds things. It's not even in the original source. But the topic today, if you don't mind if I talk about that real quickly, is not just the funny things, but some things that are really, really important to talk about. It's coming up a lot with AI in general. And it's related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because these systems are biased. And we've seen many articles about this recently. There's sexism and racism and a perpetuation of other socioeconomic cultural biases. And I just read an article the other day about a woman who works in AI and facial recognition, and she's Black. And the facial recognition, first of all, didn't recognize her, could not facially recognize her, because the systems have been trained on white males. So
the people who wrote it, right?
Right. And so she took it to try to see if, an important person like Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Obama and Serena Williams were all over the place. And it thought they were all male, and it couldn't recognize their face because they were Black. So she just said, this is really, really important. And we see this more and more. You might have doctor and nurse in an article, and with languages that have gender associated with their nouns, for example, will often translate doctor as a male and the nurse as a female. And this is just all over the place. And I was talking to somebody at Facebook the other day, and they said that there's a lot of issues with that are kind of catastrophic that we have to be careful about. And I'm hoping that actually one of our events coming up, they'll do a talk about this. What if you are trying to tell people in COVID to wash hands, but it's instead telling you to shake hands?
Right.
And that happens. And so, you could be telling people the wrong thing that could be catastrophic for somebody. So those are the kind of, I think, bias is something that is very prevalent in AI, and it's leaking into machine translation as well. And so I think these are the kind of things that going forward, you're going to see a lot more talk about this.
And you actually had a little progression there where you went from funny mistranslation to misleading. It's not a golf course of study, it's a golf course of walking, to offensive to dangerous.
Right.
And that's quite a progression at the same time that everything is sped up so much and people want to get faster things out the door, CI/CD, continuous delivery, and stuff like that. Misha, do you have any points that you want to add on this? Which is, you got some underserved region. Do we give them something that might not be good enough, or do we give them nothing?
So for us, at this point at least, we are not sure in the quality of what we can give them if we just do automatic. So we would just proceed with English because we are sure that is good enough. And while in some cases, like for some countries, or for example, French-speaking Africa, we can also use French because, there will be some differences, of course, but they're not major. It will be okay for us to use French. The same as like we can use Brazilian Portuguese in Portugal, and the same. It is like there are some differences, and of course, people will reach out to us and inform us of the differences in the language and their terms in different languages. Sure. But for us, we understand that it's better for them because they will be able to read. And I guess it's all what it comes down to. Can they do what they want to achieve or not? If they can do it better with English, let's go and give them English. If we have a good enough translation, good enough adaptation of something which they will be more successful than in English, definitely. But then it really depends on country, depends on the region, on language.
As much as we think that this is about algorithms and science and technology, a lot of this is art and judgment. And people are going to find out the hard way on this. Janice, get us out of the discussion with a little bit of talk about the value of localization, maybe machine translation, for threatened languages.
Yes. Well, there are some projects out there. They're more led by nonprofits, endangered languages projects, which I think Google is a part of. I haven't been really involved in it, so I don't know so much, but you'll find it in many places, especially on social media, information about it. There's also, I think last year was the UNESCO Year of Indigenous Languages. So in localization and machine translation, we call those low resource languages or even long tail languages because they might not have a lot of data. So it's very difficult to train an engine to, and I use engine meaning, a model, a machine translation model. It's very difficult to train them when you don't have a lot of data. And you might have a lot of data, but it's not in your domain. And so it's difficult to get it done. And there's a lot of research being done on that. We do want to be able to offer where we think that people are going to be using the products and needing things in their language. And machine translation, to some extent, hasn't been able to achieve that very easily for those languages which we call low resource. There's another project that I think Translation Commons was working on with UNESCO and I'm not really sure, but digitizing languages. So there are many languages in the world where there's maybe not even a script. But there is a script, then they have never gone to the internet. They've not been, adapted for use by software, by any kind of computerization or. Those are projects that people are working on. Many of these are led by NGOs and other types of organizations and foundations trying to get their languages on board because this is how knowledge spreads.
Mm-hmm. It's we talk about getting software products to market, but in the last this bit of discussion, these are people, and this is the history of cultures and the peoples behind them, and we're trying to find a way to tell their story online through all kinds of materials and software. A very good discussion. Thanks, both of you. It's a topic that some, like me, probably think they know, probably don't. And certainly we're not really tracking this big change that's rolling in with machine translation. Let's close out with a From the Heart segment. Misha, you've been with JetBrains as it has grown a lot, continues to grow a lot, and its reach now impacts a lot of people. What's something about localization and machine translation that you'd like people to keep in mind?
I would say that it's not even specific to localization and machine translation, but generally about the approach to doing things is that we need to try to reduce our own bias in what we do. Like, I live in Germany. People around me, Germans, expats, a lot of people, professionally, I don't speak German at all. I can, but I don't because people around me in IT industry here speak perfect English. I don't need to, and everyone understands me. Can I make an assumption that we don't need to localize to other languages because people next to me in other IT companies, in Google, in Microsoft, in JetBrains, in Atlassian, and many other companies, they do speak perfect English. Can we make a decision not to localize based on that fact? Absolutely not. We need to try to remove this bias and understand what's happening outside of our bias, outside of our bubble, and just go out of the box. And one of the things I try to do, it is what I used to do. So far, I couldn't travel since last March, I think. But once a year, I would pick a vacation destination which would trouble me, in a way that I go there. Mostly, for example, in Asia, there are a lot of countries you can go to, and you will not be understood. Your English will not be okay, especially go to some villages and try to survive there with your English. And that's actually eye-opening. And that used to be eye-opening for me when I started that tradition some years ago. You go there, you're out of context. You don't understand what the hell is happening around you. People are screaming and saying something in the languages you don't understand. And that puts you outside of the bubble. And that's when you understand that you cannot judge based on your experience. And we are all biased. And that's very important for their localization and for all the people listening. try this exercise. Go somewhere where English is not universally understood, and you will understand why you need to at least internationalize your software, and then make sure that others can understand what you write about or what you have an interface.
I've got 360 million Americans who should listen to you and go gain a little bit of perspective about not being the center of the universe. But also your point about sometimes the choice, you're talking about the choice about whether to do German or not. The easy choice, the obvious choice might be the wrong choice because you're in your bubble and you don't have enough facts in order to make an informed decision. Janice, this is a field you spent, your professional life on, met a lot of people, looked at it from a lot of angles. Machine translation is going to be a big disruption. What's one thing you'd like people to take away?
I think it's equity in access to information and knowledge. And I think machine translation can help us with that. It can help us to preserve languages as well. And there's actually a book written about that, When Languages Die. And when languages die, so does human knowledge.
Interesting. And where are we on that? Have we got a long way to go, or are we doing all right?
Long way to go. But there are many people working on it, trying to digitize languages and preserve them. There are languages where maybe there's only like 5 speakers left in the world. So
sure, right.
And it's knowledge that is lost. It's maybe inevitable. You're going to lose, some languages, but can you preserve the knowledge from it?
Yeah. Thanks, both of you. Change is coming. Hopefully we keep these points in mind. That's it for today's JetBrains Connect. Janice, thanks for joining us, for taking the time in preparation to help us get oriented on the topic, and for sharing your experiences over the years, takeaways that you've gathered along the way.
Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate the many things that both your questions as well as Misha's remarks that really helped to supplement and complement very well what I've said on this topic.
Well said. Misha, you have many jobs at JetBrains, including taking on this hard, subtle localization effort. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Luckily, I'm not the one to execute on the localization strategy. We have amazing teams inside JetBrains to do that. And I'm probably the one to push them sometimes. But yeah, they do the job, not me. And that was really a great pleasure talking to Janice and Paul today about the localization efforts. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode of JetBrains Connect, topics and talk from across the landscape of technology. Don't forget to leave some comments. We want to hear your point of view about today's show, or really any feedback about JetBrains Connect. Let's hear your ideas. Want more? We got more. Click subscribe down below. See you next time.